CHAPTER V THE BATTLE OF the CHEMISTS Some years ago the nations of the world gathered at the city of The Hague, in Holland, to see what could be done to put an end to war. They did not accomplish much in that direction, but they did draw up certain rules of warfare which they agreed to abide by. There were some practices which were considered too horrible for any civilized nation to indulge in. Among these was the use of poisonous gases, and Germany was one of the nations that took a solemn pledge not to use gas in war. 18 years later the German army had dug itself into a line of trenches reaching from the English Channel to Switzerland, and facing them in another line of trenches were the armies of France and England, determined to hold back the invaders. Neither side could make an advance without frightful loss of life. But a German scientist came forth with a scheme for breaking the deadlock. This was Professor Nernst, the inventor of a well-known electric lamp and a man who had always violently hated the British. His plan was to drown out the British with a flood of poisonous gas. To be sure, there was the pledge taken at the Hague Conference, but why should that stand in Germany's way? What cared the Germans for promises now? Already they had broken a pledge in their violation of Belgium. Already they had rained explosives from the sky on unfortified British cities, thus violating another pledge of the Hague Conference. Already they had determined to war on defenseless merchantmen. To them promises meant nothing, if such promises interfered with the success of German arms. They led the world in the field of chemistry. Why, they reasoned, shouldn't they make use of this advantage? Pouring gas like water. It was really a new mode of warfare that the Germans were about to launch, and it called for much study. In the first place, they had to decide what sort of gas to use. It must be a gas that could be obtained in large quantities. It must be a very poisonous gas that would act quickly on the enemy. It must be easily compressed and liquefied so that it could be carried in containers that were not too bulky. It must vaporize when the pressure was released, and it must be heavier than air, so that it could not be diluted by the atmosphere, but would hug the ground. You can pour gas just as you pour water if it is heavier than air. A heavy gas will stay in the bottom of an unstoppered bottle and can be poured from one bottle into another like water. If the gas is colored, you can see it flowing, just as if it were a liquid. On the other hand, a gas which is much lighter than air can also be kept in unstoppered bottles if the bottles are turned upside down, and the gas can be poured from one bottle into another, but it flows up instead of down. Chlorine gas was selected because it seemed to meet all requirements. For the gas attack a point was chosen where the ground sloped gently toward the opposing lines, so that the gas would actually flow downhill into them. Preparations were carried out with the utmost secrecy. Just under the parapet of the trenches deep pits were dug, about a yard apart, on a front of 15 miles, or over 25,000 pits. In these pits were placed the chlorine tanks, each weighing about 90 pounds. Each pit was then closed with a plank, and this was covered with a quilt filled with peat moss soaked in potash, so that in case of any leakage the chlorine would be taken up by the potash and rendered harmless. Over the quilts sandbags were piled to a considerable height to protect the tanks from shell fragments. Liquid chlorine will boil even in a temperature of 28 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, but in tanks it cannot boil because there is no room for it to turn into a gas. Upon release of the pressure at ordinary temperatures, the liquid boils violently and big clouds of gas are produced. If the gas were tapped off from the top of the cylinder, it would freeze on pouring out, because any liquid that turns into a gas has to draw heat from its surroundings. The greater the expansion, the more heat the gas absorbs, and in the case of the chlorine tanks, had the nozzles been set in the top of the tank, they would very quickly have been crusted with frost and choked, stopping the flow. but the Germans had anticipated this difficulty, and instead of drawing off the gas from the top of the tank, they drew off the liquid from the bottom in small leaden tubes, which passed up through the liquid in the tank and were kept as warm as the surrounding liquid. In fact, it was not gas from the top of the tank, but liquid from the bottom that was streamed out, and this did not turn into gas until it had left the nozzle. Waiting for the wind. Everything was ready for the attack on the British in April, 1915. A point had been chosen where the British lines made a juncture with the French. The Germans reckoned that a joint of this sort in the opponent's lines would be a spot of weakness. Also, they had very craftily picked out this particular spot because the French portion of the line was manned by Turcos, or Algerians, who would be likely to think there was something supernatural about a death-dealing cloud. On the left of the Africans was a division of Canadians, but the main brunt of the gas was designed to fall upon the Turcos. Several times the attack was about to be made, but was abandoned because the wind was not just right. The Germans wished to pick out a time when the breeze was blowing steadily, not so fast as to scatter the gas, but yet so fast that it would overtake men who attempted to run away from it. It was not until April 22nd that conditions were ideal, and then the new mode of warfare was launched. Just as had been expected, the Turcos were awestruck when they saw, coming out of the German trenches, volumes of greenish-yellow gas, which rolled towards them, pouring down into shell holes and flowing over into the trenches as if it were liquid. They were seized with superstitious fear, particularly when the gas overcame numbers of them, stifling them and leaving them gasping for breath. Immediately there was a panic, and they raced back, striving to outspeed the pursuing cloud. For a stretch of 15 miles the Allied trenches were emptied, and the Germans, who followed in the wake of the gas, met with no opposition except in the sector held by the Canadians. Here, on the fringe of the gas cloud, so determined a fight was put up that the Germans faltered, and the brave Canadians held them until reinforcements arrived and the gap in the line was closed. The Germans themselves were new at the game, or they could have made a complete success of this surprise attack. Had they made the attack on a broader front, nothing could have kept them from breaking through to Calais. The valiant Canadians, who struggled and fought without protection in the stifling clouds of chlorine, were almost wiped out. But many of them who were on the fringe of the cloud escaped by wetting handkerchiefs, socks, or other pieces of cloth, and wrapping them around their mouths and noses. The world was horrified when it read of this German gas attack, but there was no time to be lost. Immediately orders went out for gas masks, and in all parts of England and of France as well, women were busy sewing the masks. These were very simple affairs, merely a pad of cotton soaked in washing soda and arranged to be tied over the mouth and nose. But when the next attack came, not long after the first, the men were prepared in some measure for it, and again it failed to bring the Germans the success they had counted upon. One thing that the Germans had not counted upon was the fact that the prevailing winds in Flanders blow from west to east. During the entire summer and autumn of 1915, the winds refused to favor them, and no gas attacks were staged from June to December. This gave the British a long respite and enabled them not only to prepare better gas masks, but also to make plans to give the Hun a dose of his own medicine. When the wind played a trick on the Germans. There were many disadvantages in the use of gas clouds, which developed as the Germans gathered experience. The gas started from their own lines in a very dense cloud, but the cloud grew thinner and thinner as it traveled toward the enemy, and lost a great deal of its strength. If the wind were higher than 15 miles an hour, it would swirl the gas around and dissipate it before it did much harm to the opposing fighters. If the wind were light, there were other dangers. On one occasion in 1916, a cloud of gas was released upon an Irish regiment. The wind was rather fickle. It carried the gas toward the British trenches, but before reaching them the cloud hesitated, the wind veered around, and soon the gas began to pour back upon the German lines. The Germans were entirely unprepared for this boomerang attack. Many of the Huns had no gas masks on, and those who had found that the masks were not in proper working order. As a result of this whim of the winds, 11,000 Germans were killed. While chlorine was the first gas used, it was evident that it was not the only one that could be employed. British chemists had suspected that the Germans would use phosgene, which was a much more deadly gas, and in the long interval between June and December 1915, masks were constructed which would keep out not only the fumes of chlorine, but also the more poisonous phosgene. In one of their sorties, the British succeeded in capturing some valuable notes on gas attacks belonging to a German general, which showed that the Germans were actually preparing to use phosgene. This deadly gas is more insidious in its action than chlorine. The man who inhales phosgene may not know that he is gassed. He may experience no ill effects, but hours afterward, particularly if he is exercised in the meantime, he may suddenly fall dead owing to its paralyzing action on the heart. Freeing the British trenches of rats. Phosgene was not used alone, but had to be mixed with chlorine, and the deadly combination of the two destroyed all life for miles behind the trenches. However, the British were ready for it. They had been drilled to put on their masks in a few seconds' time on the first warning of a gas attack. When the clouds of chlorine and phosgene came over No Man's Land, they were prepared, and except for casualties among men whose masks proved defective, the soldiers in the trenches came through with very few losses. All animal life, however, was destroyed. This was a blessing to the British Tommy, whose trenches had been overrun with rats. The British had tried every known method to get rid of these pests, and now, thanks to the Germans, their quarters were most effectively fumigated with phosgene, and every rat was killed. If only the cooties could have been destroyed in the same way, the Germans might have been forgiven many of their offenses. The disadvantages in the use of gas clouds became increasingly apparent. What was wanted was some method of placing the gas among the opponents in concentrated form, without wasting any of it on its way across from one line to the other. This led to the use of shell filled with materials which would produce gas. There were many advantages in these shell. They could be thrown exactly where it was desired that they should fall without the help of the fickle winds. When the shell landed and burst, the full effect of its contents was expended upon the enemy. A gas cloud would rise over a wood, but with shell the wood would be filled with gas, which, once there, would lurk among the trees for days. Chemicals could be used in shell which could not be used in a cloud attack. The shell could be filled with a liquid or even with a solid, because when it burst the filling would be minutely pulverized. And so German chemists were set to work devising all sorts of fiendish schemes for poisoning, choking, or merely annoying their opponents. Gas that made one weep. One of the novel shell the Germans used was known as the tear gas shell. This was filled with a liquid, the vapor of which was very irritating to the eyes. The liquid vaporized very slowly, and so its effect would last a long time. However, the vapor did not permanently injure the eyes. It merely filled them with tears to such an extent that a soldier was unable to see, and consequently was confused and retarded in his work. The tear gas shell was marked with a T by the Germans, and were known as T shell. Another type of shell, known as the K shell, contained a very poisonous liquid, the object of which was to destroy the enemy quickly. The effect of this shell was felt at once, but it left no slow vapors on the ground, and so it could be followed up almost immediately by an attack. Later on the Germans developed three types of gas shell, one known as the Green Cross, another as the Yellow Cross, and the third as the Blue Cross. The Green Cross shell was filled with diphosgene, or a particularly dangerous combination of phosgene in liquid form, which would remain in pools on the ground or soak into the ground and would vaporize when it became warm. Its vapors were deadly. One had always to be on his guard against them. In the morning, when the sun warmed the earth and vapors were seen to rise from the damp soil, tests were made of the vapors to see whether it was mere water vapor or diphosgene before men were allowed to walk through it. These vapors were heavier than air and would flow down into a trench, filling every nook and cranny. If phosgene entered a trench by a direct hit, the liquid would remain there for days, rendering that part of the trench uninhabitable except by men in gas masks. The infected part of the trench, however, was cut off from the rest of the trench by means of gas locks. In other words, blankets were used to keep the gas out, and usually 2 blankets were hung so that a man in passing from one part of the trench to another could lift up the first blanket, pass under it, and close it carefully behind him before opening the second blanket, which led into the portion of the trench that was not infected. The Germans had all sorts of fiendish schemes for increasing the discomfort of the Allies. For instance, to some of their diphosgene shell they added a gas which caused intense vomiting. The Yellow Cross shell was another fiendish invention of the Huns. It was popularly known as mustard gas, and was intended not to kill, but merely to discomfort the enemy. The gas had a peculiar penetrating smell, something like garlic, and its fumes would burn the flesh wherever it was exposed to them, producing great blisters and sores that were most distressing. The material in the shell was a liquid which was very hard to get rid of because it would vaporize so slowly. On account of the persistence of this vapor, lasting as it did for days, these gas shell were usually not fired by the Germans on lines that they expected to attack immediately. The sneezing shell. The Blue Cross shell was comparatively harmless, although very annoying. It contained a solid which was atomized by the explosion of the shell, and which, after it got into the nostrils, caused a violent sneezing. The material, however, was not poisonous and did not produce any casualties to speak of, although it was most unpleasant. A storm of Blue Cross shell could be followed almost immediately by an attack, because the effect of the shell would have been dissipated before the attackers reached the enemy, who were still suffering from the irritation of their nostrils. Gas masks. As the different kinds of gas shell were developed, the gas masks were improved to meet them. In every attack there were duds, or unexploded shell, which the chemists of the Allies analyzed. Also, they were constantly experimenting with new gases themselves, and often could anticipate the Germans. The Allies were better able to protect themselves against gas attacks than the Germans, because there was a scarcity of rubber in Germany for the manufacture of masks. When it was found that phosgene was going to be used, the simple cotton wad masks had to give way to more elaborate affairs with chemicals that would neutralize this deadly gas. And later, when the mustard gas was used, which attacked the eyes, and the sneezing gas, that attacked the nose, it was found necessary to cover the face completely, particularly the eyes, and so helmets of rubber were constructed, which were tightly fitted around the neck under the coat collar. The inhaled air was purified by passage through a box or can filled with chemicals and charcoal made of various materials, such as coconut shells, peach pits, horse chestnuts, and the like. Because the Germans had no rubber to spare, they were obliged to use leather, which made their masks stiff and heavy. Glass that will not shatter. One of the greatest difficulties that had to be contended with was the covering of the eyes. There was danger in the use of glass, because it was liable to be cracked or broken, letting in the deadly fumes and gassing the wearer. Experiments were made with celluloid and similar materials, but the finest gas masks produced in the war were those made for our own soldiers, in which the goggles were of glass, built up in layers, with a celluloid-like material between, which makes a tough composition that will stand up against a very hard blow. Even if it cracks, this glass will not shatter. The glasses were apt to become coated on the inside with moisture coming from the perspiration of the face, and some means had to be provided for wiping them off. The French hit upon a clever scheme of having the inhaled air strike the glasses in a jet which would dry off the moisture and keep the glasses clear. Before this was done, the masks were provided with little sponges on the end of a finger piece with which the glasses could be wiped dry without taking the masks off. But all this time the Allies were not merely standing on the defensive. No sooner had the Germans launched their first attack than the British and French chemists began to pay back the Hun in kind. More attention was paid to the shell than the cloud attack, and soon gas shell began to rain upon the Germans. Not only were the German shell copied, but new gases were tried. Gas shell were manufactured in immense quantities. Then America took a hand in the war, and our chemists added their help, while our factories turned out steady streams of shell. If Germany wanted gas warfare, the Allies were determined that she should have it. Our chemists were not afraid to be pitted against the German chemists, and the factories of the Allies were more than a match for those of the Central Powers. When the Germans first started the use of gas, apparently they counted only their own success, which they thought would be immediate and overwhelming. They soon learned that they must take what they gave. The Allies set them a pace that they could not keep up with. When the armistice brought the war to a sudden stop, the United States alone was making each day 2 tons of gas for every mile of the Western Front. If the war had continued, the Germans would have simply been deluged. As it was, they were getting far more gas than they could possibly produce in their own factories, and they had plenty of reason to regret their rash disregard of their contract at the Hague Conference. One gas we were making was of the same order as mustard gas, but far more volatile, and had we had a chance to use it against the Germans, they would have found it very difficult to protect themselves against its penetrating fumes. Battling with liquid fire. Somewhat associated with gas warfare was another form of offensive which was introduced with the purpose of breaking up the deadlock of trench warfare. A man could protect himself against gas by using a suitable mask and clothing, but what could he do against fire? It looked as if trench defenders would have to give up if attacked with fire, and so early in the war the Germans devised apparatus for shooting forth streams of liquid fire, and the Allies were not slow to copy the idea. The apparatus was either fixed or portable, but it was not often that the fixed apparatus could be used to advantage, because at best the range of the flame thrower was limited, and in few places were the trenches near enough for flaming oil to be thrown across the intervening gap. For this reason portable apparatus was chiefly used, with which a man could send out a stream for from 100 to 150 feet. On his back he carried the oil tank, in the upper part of which there was a charge of compressed air. A pipe led from the tank to a nozzle, which the man held in his hand, using it to direct the spray. There was some danger to the operator in handling a highly inflammable oil. The blaze might flare back and burn him, particularly when he was lighting the stream, and so a special way of setting fire to the spray had to be devised. Of course, the value of the apparatus lay in its power to shoot the stream as far as possible. The compressed air would send the stream to a good distance, but after lighting, the oil might be consumed before it reached the desired range. Some way had to be found of igniting the oil stream far from the nozzle, or as near the limit of its range as possible. And so 2 nozzles were used, one with a small opening so that it would send out a fine jet of long range, while the main stream of oil issued from the second nozzle. The first nozzle was movable with respect to the second, and the two streams could be regulated to come together at any desired distance from the operator within the range of the apparatus. The fine stream was ignited and carried the flame out to the main stream, setting the fire to it near the limit of its range. In this way a flare back was avoided and the oil blazed where the flame was needed. The same sort of double nozzle was used on the stationary apparatus, and because weight was not a consideration, heavier apparatus was used which shot the stream to a greater distance. But flame-throwing apparatus had its drawbacks. There was always the danger that the tank of highly inflammable oil might be burst open by a shell or hand grenade and its contents set on fire. The fixed apparatus was buried under bags of sand, but the man who carried flame-throwing apparatus on his back had to take his chances, not knowing at what instant the oil he carried might be set ablaze, turning him into a living, writhing human torch. Because of this hazard, liquid fire did not play a very important part in trench warfare. To set fire to the spray at its source with a well-directed hand grenade was too easy. The fire broom. There were certain situations, however, in which liquid fire played a very important part. After a line of trenches had been captured, it was difficult to clear out the enemy who lurked in dugouts and underground passages. They would not surrender, and from their hidden recesses they could pour out a deadly machine gun fire. The only way of dislodging them was to use the fire broom. In other words, a stream of liquid fire was poured into the dugout, burning out the men trapped in it. If there were a second exit, they would come tumbling out in a hurry. If not, they would be burned to death. After the first sweep of the broom, if there were any survivors, there would not be any fight left in them, and they would be quick to surrender before being subjected to a second dose of fire. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Tanks. There is no racehorse that can keep up with an automobile, no deer that can outrun a locomotive. A bicyclist can soon tire out the hardiest of hounds. Why? Because animals run on legs, while machines run on wheels. As wheels were so much more speedy than legs, it seems odd that we do not find this form of locomotion in nature. There are many animals that owe their very existence to the fact that they can run fast. Why hasn't nature put them on wheels, so that when their enemy appears they can roll away sedately, instead of having to jerk their legs frantically back and forth at the rate of 100 strokes a minute? But one thing we must not overlook. Our wheeled machines must have a special road prepared for them, either a macadam highway or a steel track. They are absolutely helpless when they are obliged to travel over rough country. No wheeled vehicle can run through fields broken by ditches and swampy spots, or over ground obstructed with boulders and tree stumps. But it is not always possible or practicable to build a road for the machines to travel upon, and it is necessary to have some sort of self-propelled vehicle that can travel over all kinds of ground. Some time ago a British inventor developed a machine with large wheels on which were mounted the equivalent of feet. As the wheels revolved, these feet would be planted firmly on the ground, one after the other, and the machine would proceed step by step. It could travel over comparatively rough ground, and could actually walk up a flight of stairs. We have a very curious walking machine in this country. It is a big dredge provided with two broad feet and a swivel chair. The machine makes progress by alternately planting its feet on the ground, lifting itself up, chair and all, pushing itself forward, and sitting down again. Although many other types of walking machines have been patented, none of them has amounted to very much. Clearly, nature hopelessly outclasses us in this form of propulsion. Years ago it occurred to one ingenious man that if wheeled machines must have tracks or roads for their wheels to run on, they might be allowed to lay their own tracks. And so he arranged his track in the form of an endless chain of plates that ran around the wheels of his machine. The wheels merely rolled on this chain, and as they progressed, new links of the track were laid down before them, and the links they had passed over were picked up behind them. A number of inventors worked on the idea, but one man in particular, Benjamin Holt, of Peoria, Illinois, brought the invention to a high state of perfection. He arranged a series of wheels along the chain track, each carrying a share of the load of the machine, and each mounted on springs so that it would yield to any unevenness of the ground, just as a caterpillar conforms itself to the hills and dales of the surface it creeps over. In fact, the machine was called a caterpillar tractor because of its crawling locomotion. But it was no worm of a machine. In power it was a very elephant. It could haul loads that would tax the strength of scores of horses. Stumps and boulders were no obstacles in its path. Even ditches could not bar its progress. The machine would waddle down one bank and up the other without the slightest difficulty. It was easily steered. In fact, it could turn around in its own length by traveling forward on one of its chains, or traction belts, and backward on the other. The machine was particularly adapted to travel on soft or plowed ground, because the broad traction belts gave it a very wide bearing and spread its weight over a large surface. It was set to work on large farms, hauling gangs of plows and cultivators. Little did Mr. Holt think, as he watched his powerful mechanical elephants at work on the vast western wheat fields, that they, or rather their offspring, would some day play a leading role in a war that would rack the whole world. But we are getting ahead of our story. To start at the very beginning, we must go back to the time when the first savage warrior used a plank of wood to protect himself from the rocks hurled by his enemy. This was the start of the never-ending competition between arms and armor. As the weapons of offense developed from stone to spear to arrow to arquebus, the wooden plank developed into a shield of brass and then of steel, and then, since a separate shield became too bothersome to carry, it was converted into armor that the warrior would wear, and so have both hands free for battle. For every improvement in arms, there was a corresponding improvement in armor. After gunpowder was invented, the idea of armor for men began to wane, because no armor could be built strong enough to ward off the rifle bullet, and at the same time light enough for a man to wear. The struggle between arms and armor was then confined to the big guns and the steel protection of forts and warships. But not so long ago the machine gun was invented, and this introduced a new phase of warfare. Not more than one rifle bullet in 1,000 find its mark on the battlefield. The Boers in the Battle of Colenso established a record with one hit in 600 shots. In the excitement of battle, men are too nervous to take careful aim, and they are apt to fire either too high or too low, so that the mortality is not nearly so great as some would expect. But with the machine gun there is not this waste of ammunition, because it fires a stream of bullets, the effect of which can readily be determined by the man who operates the volley. The difference between the machine gun fire and rifle fire is something like the difference between hitting a tin can with a stone or with a stream of water. It is no easy matter to score a hit with a stone, but anyone can train a garden hose on the can, because he can see where the water is striking and move his hose accordingly until he covers the desired spot. In the same way, with the machine gun, it is much easier to train the stream of bullets upon the mark, and having once found the mark, to hold the aim. That is one reason why the destruction of a machine gun is so tremendous. Another, of course, being that it will discharge so many more shots per minute than the common rifle. In the Russo-Japanese War, the Russians played havoc with the attacking Japanese at Port Arthur by using carefully concealed machine guns, and the German military attachés were quick to note the value of the machine gun. Secretly they manufactured large numbers of machine guns and established a special branch of service to handle the guns, and they developed the science of using them with telling effect. And so, when the recent Great War suddenly broke out, they surprised the world with the countless number of machine guns they possessed and the efficient use to which they put them. Thousands of British soldiers in the early days of the war fell victims to these death-dealing machines. 2 or 3 men with a machine gun could defy several companies of soldiers, especially when the attackers had to cut their way through barbed wire entanglements. It was clearly evident that something must be done to defend the men against the machine gun, for to charge against it meant simply wholesale slaughter. At first, the only means of combating the machine guns seemed to be to destroy them with shell fire. But they were carefully concealed, and it was difficult to search them out. Only by long continued bombardment was it possible to destroy them and tear away the barbed wire sufficiently to permit of a charge. Before an enemy position was stormed, it was subjected to the fire of thousands of guns of all calibers for hours and even days. But this resulted in notifying the enemy that a charge was ere long to be attempted at a certain place, and he could assemble his reserves for a counterattack. Furthermore, the Germans learned to conceal their machine guns in dugouts 20 or 30 feet underground, where they were safe from the fire of the big guns, and then, when the fire let up, the weapons would be dragged up to the surface in time to mow down the approaching infantry. It was very clear that something would have to be done to combat the machine gun. If the necessary armor was too heavy for the men to carry, it must carry itself. Armored automobiles were of no service at all, because they could not possibly travel over the shell-pitted ground of no man's land. The Russians tried a big steel shield mounted on wheels, which a squad of soldiers would push ahead of them, but their plan failed because the wheels would get stuck in shell holes. A one-man shield on wheels was tried by the British. Under its shelter a man could steal up to the barbed wire and cut it, and even crawl up to a machine gun emplacement and destroy it with a hand grenade. But this did not prove very successful either, because the wheels did not take kindly to the rough ground of the battlefield. And here is where we come back to Mr. Holt's mechanical elephants. Just before the Great War broke out, Belgium, poor, unsuspecting Belgium, was holding an agricultural exhibit. An American tractor was on exhibition. It was the one developed by Mr. Holt, and its remarkable performances gained for it a reputation that spread far and wide. Colonel E.D. Swinton of the British Army heard of the peculiar machine, and immediately realized the advantages of an armored tractor for battle over torn ground. But in the first few months of the war that ensued, this idea was forgotten until the effectiveness of the machine gun and the necessity for overcoming it recalled the matter to his mind. At his suggestion, a Caterpillar tractor was procured, and the military engineers set themselves to the task of designing an armored body to ride on the Caterpillar tractor belts. Of course, the machine had to be entirely redesigned. The tractor was built for hauling loads and not to climb out of deep shell holes. But by running the traction belts over the entire body of the car and running the forward part of the tractor up at a sharp angle, the engineers overcame that difficulty. In war, absolute secrecy is essential to the success of any invention, and the British engineers were determined to let no inkling of the new armored automobiles reach the enemy. Different parts of the machines were made in different factories, so that no one would have an idea of what the whole would look like. At first the new machine was known as a land cruiser or land ship, but it was feared that this very name would give a clue to spies, and so any descriptive name was forbidden. Many of the parts consisted of rolled steel plates, which might easily be used in building up vessels to hold water or gasoline. And to give the impression that such vessels were being constructed, the name tank was adopted. The necessity of guarding even the name of the machine was shown later, when rumors leaked out that the tanks were being built to carry water over the desert regions of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Another curious rumor was that the machines were snow plows for use in Russia. To give some semblance of truth to this story, the parts were carefully labeled "For Petrograd." Probably never was a military secret so well guarded as this one, and when, on September 15, 1916, the waddling steel tractors loomed up out of the morning mists, the German fighters were taken completely by surprise. 2 days before, their airmen had noticed some peculiar machines which they supposed were armored automobiles. They had no idea, however, that such formidable monsters were about to descend upon them. The tanks proceeded leisurely over the shell-torn regions of No Man's Land, wallowing down into shell holes and clambering up out of them with perfect ease. They straddled the trenches and paused to pour down them streams of machine gun bullets. Wire entanglements were nothing to them. Under their weight, steel wire snapped like thread. The big brutes marched up and down the lines of wire, treading them down into the ground and clearing the way for the infantry. Even trees were no barrier to these tanks. Of course, they did not attack large ones, but the smallish trees were simply broken down before their onslaughts. As for concrete emplacements for machine guns, the tanks merely rode over them and crushed them. Those who attempted to defend themselves in the ruins of buildings found that the tanks could plow right through walls and bring them down in a shower of brick and stone. There was no stopping these monsters, and the Germans fled in consternation before them. There were two sizes of tanks. The larger ones aimed to destroy the machine gun emplacements, and they were fitted up with guns for firing a shell. The smaller tanks, armed with machine guns, devoted themselves to fighting the infantry. British soldiers following in the wake of the bulletproof tank were protected from the shots of the enemy and were ready to attack him with bayonets when the time was ripe. But the tanks also furnished an indirect protection for the troops. It was not necessary for the men to conceal themselves behind the big tractors. Naturally, every Hun who stood his ground and fought directed all his fire upon the tanks, leaving the British infantry free to charge virtually unmolested. The success of the tank was most pronounced. In the meantime, the French had been informed of the plans of their allies, and they set to work on a different design of tractor. It was not until 6 months later that their machines saw service. The French design differed from the British mainly in having the tractor belt confined to the wheels instead of running over the entire body of the tank. It was more blunt than the British, and was provided at the forward end with a steel cutting edge, which adapted it to break its way through wire entanglements. At each end there are two upward turning skids, which help the tanks to lift themselves out of a hole. The larger machines carried a regular 75 mm. (3-inch) field gun, which is a very formidable weapon. They carried a crew of 1 officer and 7 men. Life in a tank is far from pleasant. The heat and the noise of machinery and guns are terrific. Naturally, ventilation is poor, and the fumes and gases that accumulate are most annoying, to say the least. Sometimes the men were overcome by them. But war is war, and such discomforts had to be endured. But the tank possessed one serious defect, which the Germans were not slow to discover. Its armor was proof against machine gun fire, but it could not ward off the shells of field guns, and it was such a slow traveler that the enemy did not find it a very difficult task to hit it with rapid-fire gun if the gunner could see his target. And so the Germans ordered up their guns to the front lines, where they could score direct hits. Only light guns were used for this purpose, especially those whose rifling was worn down by long service, because long range was not necessary for tank fighting. When the Germans began their final great drive, it was rumored that they had built some monster tanks that were far more formidable than anything the Allies had produced. Unlike the British, they used the tank not to lead the army, but to follow and destroy small nests of French and British that were left behind. When the French finally did capture one of the German tanks, which had fallen into a quarry, it proved to be a poor imitation. It was an ugly looking affair, very heavy and cumbersome. Owing to the scarcity of materials for producing high grade armor, it had to make up in thickness of plating what it lacked in quality of steel. The tank was intended to carry a crew of 18 men, and it fairly bristled with guns, but it could not maneuver as well as the British tank. For when some weeks later a fleet of German tanks encountered a fleet of heavy British tanks, the Hun machines were completely routed. It was then that the British sprang another surprise upon the Germans. After the big fellows had done their work, a lot of baby tanks appeared on the scene and chased the German infantry. These little tanks could travel at a speed of 12 miles an hour, which is about as fast as an ordinary man can run. Whippets, the British called them because they were like the speedy little dogs of that name. They carried but 2 men, one to guide the tank and the other to operate the machine gun. The French, too, built a light mosquito tank, which was even smaller than the British tank and fully as fast. It was with these machines, which could dart about quickly on the battlefield and dodge the shell of the field guns, and which were immune to the fire of the machine gun, that the Allies were able to make progress against the Germans. When the Germans retired, they left behind them nests of machine guns to cover the withdrawal of their armies. These gunners were ordered to fight to the very end. They looked for no mercy and expected no help. Had it not been for the light tanks, it would have been well nigh impossible to overcome these determined bodies of men without frightful losses. Since America invented the machine gun and also barbed wire, and since America furnished the inspiration for the tank with which to trample down the wire entanglements and stamp out the machine guns, naturally people expected our Army to come out with something better than anything produced by our Allies. We did turn out a number of heavy machines patterned after the original British tank, with armor that could stand up against heavy fire, and we also produced a small and very speedy tank similar to the French baby tank. But before we could put these into service, the war ended. The tanks we did use so effectively at Saint-Mihiel and in the Argonne Forest were supplied by the French. End of chapter 6.